All right, today we're going to be talking about a few different ecological theories. This is coming from Chapter 5 in Fire in California's Ecosystems. It's called Fire as an Ecological Process. That's what Chapter 5 is called. And we're also going to try to tie these ecological theories into the overall mindset shift that we need to have in California if we want to better live with fire and create a future and a vision for the future that is more in balance with nature and hopefully leads to less extreme wildfire in the future and less losses to life and property. So just getting into these different ecological theories, I should say a disclaimer before I start this. I'm not exactly an ecologist. I've taken a few ecology classes throughout my academic career, but I'm definitely more on the meteorology and the wildfire side of things. And within wildfire, I'm much more on the fire weather than the ecology side of things. So if I misrepresent some of these ecological theories, my apologies. I'm doing my best based on what I tried to learn as I was reading this chapter. But if there's any ecologist watching this who sees or hears something that is wrong, feel free to roast me in the comments and let me know what I got wrong. But with that being said, I'll try my best here. So the first ecological theory we'll talk about is called succession theory. So this is saying that within an ecosystem, you have different stages. So you go from maybe grasses to shrubs to a young forest to a mature forest to the climax of that ecosystem, which is a very stable environment where it almost seems like life is maximized given the elevation or the amount of rainfall or the temperatures that you have in that area. Now, within that, there's also a little variation between different theories within succession theory. Not going to get into all of them. Another example would be that maybe you just have grasses at lower elevations, and then those grasses go up to, for example, oak forests as you go higher in elevation because there's more rainfall. And maybe that's what creates some of the differences you see there. But overall, within this theory, it seems like fire is viewed as a disturbance. And it kind of seems like it's viewed as something outside of the environment and something that gets in the way of reaching that climax ecosystem it's like the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. So you imagine how that would work. You have grasses, then it's maturing, it goes to shrub, then it's a young forest. Maybe it's about to be a mature forest, and then a fire comes through and sends you right back to the beginning, back to the grasses stage. So in that aspect, it would be viewed as a disturbance. So then we go on to the next theory, which is ecosystem theory. Seems like this one is pretty similar to succession theory, with the difference that it seems less to be just about the plants that you're talking about. Notice when I was talking about succession theory, I was mostly focusing on grasses to shrub to forest to the climax community. But within ecosystem theory, you still have all of that, but you're now also thinking about maybe more of the things that aren't alive. So things like the soil, and that's part of your ecosystem. And then things like temperature, your rainfall, your elevation, your topography. And instead of just viewing how the plant communities are changing, you're viewing how the entire ecosystem is changing and how energy is transforming within that ecosystem. I believe in this one, though, they still kind of view fire as something that is something that's a disturbance to the system, but I imagine there's some people within the ecosystem theory who actually do view fire as part of the ecosystem. So the next one is going to be the disturbance theory, and I think this was actually the one that I enjoyed reading about the most just because it paints an interesting visual in your mind. You imagine in the succession theory, that climax community. You would think that after thousands, if not millions of years, the entire Earth would just be in that climax community. Every inch of ground is maximized as much as possible to promote as much life as that inch of ground could possibly sustain. And that would be true over the entire Earth. Now, what gets in the way of that is different disturbances. And these could be as small a disturbance as maybe a large tree falling over, or a small fire, up to maybe a large wildfire, and then huge disturbance would be something like a hurricane. So what's, I think, most interesting about this is it takes that idea that you could just have a very uniform climax community, but instead, because of disturbances, we actually have patches or mosaics, or almost like a puzzle, where you have different stages of your ecosystem, or you have your ecosystem in different stages in different places based on when disturbances had happened in the past. So for example, let's take that succession theory where you go from grasses to mature forest. Maybe in one spot you're a mature forest because we'll use fire as our disturbance. There hasn't been a fire there in 100 years, so it's in that climax community. But then right next to that, maybe you did have a small fire that maybe cleared out some of the lower plants but didn't send it back to square one. So maybe you're in that middle ground of your stages, and then maybe next to that you have another one that's in its climax community, and then next to that you have up somewhere where a huge fire just came through last year and it basically just set the system back to square one. It's back to grasses. So instead of everything being in that climax, you have patches and a mosaic based on the disturbances that happened in the past. And how you'd classify those disturbances would be how large they were, how intense they were, how destructive they were, and the time that they happened. And then that's going to determine what current stage that part of your ecosystem is in. Now, to go into the next theory, which is hierarchical theory, and again, with disturbance theory, I didn't really mention it, but obviously in that, they're viewing fire as a disturbance because, well, that's pretty much just in the name right there. In hierarchical theory, it kind of seems like each of these theories just builds off of the last one, and each one has specific little variations or nuances that it adds. Hierarchical theory, the addition, for some reason, instead of calling them disturbances, they call them perturbations. But the main thing that hierarchical theory adds is that the disturbance, whether it's maybe good or bad for the environment, really depends on the size of the disturbance. So if your disturbance is larger than the ecosystem, obviously that would be a very bad thing. Because if you have a pine forest and a fire comes through that's larger than the pine forest, that could just wipe out maybe the entire species, at least in that area. But if you have a disturbance that's smaller than that pine forest, then it's not going to threaten the entire ecosystem. And in fact, it's actually going to promote diversity on a spatial scale within that ecosystem. So instead of every part of that ecosystem being in the exact same stage, which maybe that would actually be less stable, because it could, if everything was in the same stage, maybe if there was some kind of pest or insect or disease that came through, then the entire ecosystem would have the exact same vulnerability. That's just kind of my idea I'm throwing out there. But maybe it's actually a lot healthier to have a lot of diversity within the ecosystem. And where you get that spatial diversity is from your disturbances, as long as the disturbances are smaller than the ecosystem itself. So hierarchical theory kind of ties a lot of what we talked about together, where you end up with different stages, some maybe just in the grass stage, going up to the climax stage, but then it's within a mosaic and almost a puzzle piece, creating a lot of diversity, as long as those disturbances were, or perturbations in this case, were smaller than the ecosystem itself. So lots of interesting ecological theories right there. The one that this book, Fire in California Ecosystems, really puts forward is kind of building off of all of those, but shifting the mindset a little bit. And so I did read a little of this in some of the other theories, but really taking away the idea of fire being a disturbance to the ecosystem and instead being a part of the ecosystem. Like, for example, earlier I mentioned what determines what kind of plants you're going to have, like whether it's grass or oak forest, or whether you have pines or redwood trees. That's all going to determine, it's going to be based on your ecosystem. So what elevation are you at? What is the soil like in that area? How much rainfall do you get per year? What's the temperature? Maybe even what are your winds like? How much moisture is in the air? That's going to determine what plants you have and the ecosystem that you have. And the reason we have diverse ecosystems is because there's lots of different combinations and variations of all of those factors coming together. But the key switch that we need to have, I think, in our minds, or I don't think this, I do think this. I agree with what the book is putting forward. I'm not going to act like this is my idea. It's basically saying that instead of viewing fire as something external that disturbs the ecosystem, we actually need to view fire as part of the ecosystem. So just like we think of, it's the type of soil and the temperature and the rainfall that determines what kind of trees you're going to have, fire is also one of those factors. It's the exact same as your temperature or your soil type, because fire is an evolutionary force in itself. It selects and determines which species are going to survive, and it is a part of that natural selection that takes place within an ecosystem. So with this being said, it would be a bad thing if we were to completely remove fire from the environment, because it does provide some benefits to the environment, things like clearing out old, dead trees, or in some cases, reducing the amount of fuel accumulation you have, so then the remaining plants there have more water themselves. They don't have to share as much. But the main point I'm trying to put forward is that fire is part of the evolutionary process. And we see this with a lot of our plants in California, where they have evolved with fire to the point where some of them actually depend on fire, where their cones fall down and the cones will not open up and the seeds won't germinate until a fire comes through and clears out all the competition. So in that kind of environment, for example, it would be a very bad thing if we completely eliminated fire. If we viewed it as a disturbance and something to be eliminated instead of a natural part of the ecosystem that we should allow to take place because it's actually part of the ecosystem. So those were just some ideas. I'm going to continue to refine these ideas, and hopefully I represented the ecological theories correctly. But regardless, I think some of the lessons that we can take from the beginning of this chapter are pretty interesting, and there's a lot more to learn. So if you want to learn more about wildfire, you can come along on this journey with me, and thanks for watching.